A crystal glass chimed against a silver spoon. The bright notes severed the low murmur of the ballroom, and 300 of Austin's tech elite fell silent. At the center of the dais stood my husband, David. He raised his champagne flute. The stage lights caught the silver at his temples and the practiced warmth in his eyes. He looked down at me with a smile that could sell ice to a blizzard. "To my wife, Grace," he said. His voice carried effortlessly over the crowd. "The quiet architect of my sanity, the woman who makes all of this possible." Polite applause rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. I maintained the angle of my chin and offered the precise, polished smile expected of a visionary spouse. I let him pull me into a brief, photogenic embrace. He smelled of expensive cedar and calculated lies. My husband had just told a room full of industry titans that I was the secret to his success. What none of them knew was that my bags were already packed. By midnight, the narrative he was selling would shatter into dust. The smile I wore was a performance I had perfected exactly 14 hours earlier. That morning, the Texas sun was already baking the pavement outside our Lakeway estate. I stood in the shade of the portico handing my platinum debit card to the roofing contractor who had just finished assessing our recent hail damage. He ran the plastic through his mobile reader. A flat, discordant tone beeped in the quiet air. He frowned and swiped it a second time. "Declined, Mrs. Hathaway," he murmured. He shifted his weight and refused to meet my gaze. I excused myself and stepped into the cool, air-conditioned quiet of the foyer. The house felt hollow. I found David in his study. He stood by the window, buttoning his cuffs before his morning commute. He did not look up when I walked in. "The card did not go through," I stated. I kept my tone level. "I know." He adjusted his watch. It was a vintage piece I bought him for our 10th anniversary. "I transferred the liquid assets." "Where?" David finally met my eyes. The affection I had relied on for 2 decades was gone. In its place sat a chilling, clinical detachment. "Into the irrevocable estate trust, the one we set up 3 years ago to protect us from corporate liabilities. Remember?" The breath stalled in my chest. 3 years ago, he had handed me a thick stack of legal documents with a reassuring kiss. He framed it as standard wealth management. In Texas, community property laws usually split everything in half, but an irrevocable trust, signed away willingly, creates an impenetrable fortress. He had just locked me outside of my own life. "You planned this," I whispered. David picked up his leather briefcase. "You are a smart woman, Grace, but you have been living in a bubble I built. You will never survive without my salary. If you want to leave, then walk out the door. Just know you leave with nothing." He brushed past me. The heavy oak door clicked shut in his wake. I stood alone on the Persian rug. The central air hummed a low drone. Panic clawed at my throat, urging me to call him and beg for an explanation. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to slow. My hands curled into tight fists until my nails dug into my palms. I walked upstairs to my vanity and opened the bottom drawer. Tucked beneath silk scarves sat a velvet box holding my grandmother's heirloom ring. It was a flawless 2-carat emerald cut that David always hated. He considered it antiquated. I slipped the jewelry into my purse and grabbed my car keys. An elite forensic accountant in downtown Austin required a hefty retainer. I was going to uncover every single secret my husband had buried. If you have ever had the ground pulled out from under you by the person you trusted most, I would love to know how you handled it. How old were you when you realized you had to rebuild your life from scratch? Drop your age in the comments below because I read every single one. Welcome to Salt Vengeance, where we turn betrayal into a blueprint. Subscribe now so you never miss the rest of this journey. The heavy Texas heat clung to my skin as I parked my car in the driveway. The velvet box in my purse was empty. In its place sat a crisp receipt from a downtown pawnbroker and a signed retainer agreement from a forensic accountant. Adrenaline thrummed in my veins. I had taken the first step toward survival. Then I saw the silver luxury sport utility vehicle blocking the path to our garage. My mother-in-law, Patricia, stood on the front porch. She wore a pristine white linen suit and a look of practiced concern. Patricia came from old Dallas oil money. She had always viewed my middle-class upbringing as a genetic flaw her son had to overcome. For 20 years, I had bent over backward to earn her approval. Today, I saw her for what she truly was. I unlocked the front door, and she glided past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "David called and told me you were having a difficult morning, Grace," she said. Her eyes darted around the room. They did not linger on my face. Instead, they swept over the crystal chandelier and the imported silk rugs. I came over to offer my support during this stressful transition. Transition. It was a sterile word for a calculated execution. I watched her step into the formal living room. She ran a manicured finger over the edge of a mahogany side table. Then she picked up a bronze sculpture we purchased in Florence 10 years ago. She turned it over to check the artist's signature engraved on the base. "Such a beautiful piece," Patricia murmured. She pulled a small leather-bound notebook from her designer purse. She clicked a silver pen. "I always thought this had sentimental family value. It really belongs with the Hathaway name." The truth crystallized in my mind. She was not here to comfort a grieving daughter-in-law. She was an invading force, conducting a ruthless pre-divorce audit. She was cataloging the assets before I could claim them. David had sent his mother to ensure I did not liquidate the artwork before he formally filed the legal paperwork to lock me out. It was psychological warfare designed to make me feel like a trespasser inside my own home. I needed a shield. I needed them to believe I was exactly what David told them I was, a helpless, dependent woman spiraling into panic. "I appreciate you being here, Patricia," I said. I let my voice tremble just enough to sound authentic. I forced my shoulders to slump. "I am just so overwhelmed. David cut off the credit cards. I need to figure out how to make my own money right now." Patricia offered a thin, patronizing smile. "Oh, sweetheart, you have not worked in a corporate office in 15 years. What could you possibly do to support yourself?" "I can bake," I stammered. I wrung my hands together. "People always say they love my pastries. I can start a business. I can sell baked goods." I did not wait for her response. I rushed into the kitchen and began pulling every ingredient I could find from the walk-in pantry. Bags of flour, refined sugar, almond paste, and vanilla extract piled onto the marble island. I pulled out heavy mixing bowls and wire whisks. I needed chaos. I needed a visual distraction loud enough to blind them to my true movements. For the next 3 hours, I played the role of a desperate housewife losing her grip on reality. I turned the ovens up too high. I whipped egg whites until they collapsed into a watery mess. I let a tray of delicate macarons scorch on the bottom rack. The sharp, bitter smell of burnt sugar and charred almonds filled the house. A cloud of fine white flour settled over the dark hardwood floors and coated the stainless steel appliances. I smeared a thick streak of batter across my cheek and let genuine tears of physical exhaustion spill over my eyelashes to complete the illusion. When David walked through the door that evening, he stopped dead in his tracks. Smoke curled from the oven vents. I stood in the center of the culinary disaster, clutching a wooden spoon and weeping quietly. Patricia sat safely away at the kitchen peninsula, sipping sparkling water. She looked at her son and shook her head in mock pity. "What is going on here?" David demanded. He pinched the bridge of his nose in irritation. "I am starting an artisan bakery," I sobbed. I dropped the spoon. It clattered loudly against the tile floor. "You said I needed my own income. I am filling orders, David. I am being an entrepreneur." David let out a harsh laugh. The sound held no warmth. It was pure, unadulterated condescension. "You burnt cookies, Grace. You are making a mess of my kitchen. You cannot even manage a simple recipe, and you honestly think you can run a business? This is pathetic." He turned to his mother. They exchanged a look of profound victory. They looked at a broken woman covered in flour and felt entirely safe. Their arrogance was blinding them. They thought they had already won the war. "I need to clean up," I whispered. I kept my head down and rushed past them toward the main staircase. I locked the master bathroom door and turned on the cold water. I washed the flour and the fake tears from my face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, and the frightened housewife vanished. I opened my jewelry box and reached into a small velvet pouch hidden in the back corner. I pulled out a pair of simple pearl earrings. I wore these exact pearls 15 years ago when I pitched strategic business models to boardrooms full of older executives. They were my armor. They were the symbol of a sharp, calculating mind that David had conveniently chosen to forget. I pushed the gold post through my earlobes. The cool, heavy weight of the pearls grounded me. My tactical awakening had officially begun. I stepped into my expansive walk-in closet. Patricia was downstairs, distracted by the smoke and her own smug satisfaction. She was likely busy logging the serial numbers of our flat-screen televisions. David was pouring himself a glass of scotch in the den. I had a narrow 10-minute window. Years ago, I had purchased high-quality cubic zirconia replicas of my most expensive jewelry for a vacation to Europe. David insisted on it to prevent theft abroad. He never realized I kept the fakes. I pulled the hidden lockbox from the floor safe beneath my shoe rack. I worked in total silence. I swapped the genuine diamond tennis bracelet for the replica. I traded the authentic sapphire pendant for the glass fake. Piece by piece, I replaced hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of marital assets with cheap costume jewelry. I wrapped the authentic gems in thick paper towels. I slipped them into a white cardboard pastry box. I tied the box with a pink bakery ribbon. It looked exactly like a doomed sample of my pathetic new business venture. I carried the pastry box downstairs. Patricia was standing in the formal living room. She was copying the serial number from the back of a framed oil painting. She did not even bother to hide her notebook when I walked past. "I have to go make a delivery," I said. My voice was dull and flat. David leaned against the archway holding his drink. "Who is buying burnt cookies at 8 o'clock at night?" "A friend," I lied. "She wants to support my new endeavor." "Let her go, David," Patricia sighed. "It gives her something to do. It keeps her out of our way while we handle adult matters." I walked out the front door and got into my car. The pastry box sat securely on the passenger seat. I drove to a private secure storage facility on the edge of town. I paid for a safety deposit box in cash. I locked the real diamonds inside a steel vault where David and his aggressive lawyers could never touch them. I sat in my car in the dark parking lot and let out a long, slow breath. I was methodically mapping the battlefield. I was securing my resources while my enemies laughed at my flour-stained clothes. I was using their complacency as my greatest weapon. But survival was not enough. I needed to understand the true depth of his betrayal. When I returned home, the house was quiet. Patricia had retreated to the guest room. David was asleep in the master suite. The hallway was dark except for a sliver of yellow light spilling from his home office. He always kept that door locked. Always. But tonight, the arrogance of his presumed victory made him careless. He had left the door cracked open. The glow of his computer monitor beckoned me from the shadows. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside the room. My eyes adjusted to the bright screen. What I found waiting on his desktop would shift this fight from a battle over money to a battle over my very identity. I closed the heavy oak door of David's home office behind me. The latch clicked with a soft metallic snap that echoed in the silent house. My mother-in-law was asleep down the hall. My husband was unconscious in the master suite. The only illumination in the room came from the sprawling, curved monitor on the mahogany desk. David always left his computer running. He believed the security gates at the front of our neighborhood and the digital locks on our doors made him untouchable. He never considered the threat might already be standing inside his inner sanctum. I slid into his leather executive chair. It was still warm. I moved the mouse to wake the screen. A digital document was left open on the desktop. The title page bore the sleek, minimalist logo of Hathaway Innovations. Below the branding, a bold sans serif font displayed the title for his new venture, Project Apex. Right underneath the title sat the name of the project lead, Sarah Hathaway. my sister-in-law. Sarah possessed a master's degree in marketing and an endless wardrobe of sharp designer blazers. She lacked any foundational understanding of software development. She could pitch a product to a room full of investors, but she could not write a single line of functional code if her life depended on it. Yet here she was, formally listed as the visionary architect of a groundbreaking predictive algorithm. A hot prickle of betrayal traveled up my spine. I scrolled through the pages of the prospectus. The document outlined a revolutionary data processing model designed to anticipate shifts in the global supply chain. Page 12 contained a visual flowchart breaking down the data sequencing model. My pulse fluttered against my throat. The logic flow looked entirely too familiar. The architecture relied on a very specific, decentralized node processing system. I navigated past the financial projections and stopped at the technical appendix. Several pages of sample source code were documented to appease cautious initial investors. My eyes scanned the strings of alphanumeric text. I read through the variables and the nested functions. Then I stopped at line 42. There it was, a redundant floating point variable declaration. It was an obscure syntactical quirk. It was a highly specific, unorthodox pattern I developed decades ago because I preferred formatting my data clusters in a way that visually made sense to my own brain. A machine did not generate this code. A hired contractor did not write this. David did not write this. Sarah certainly did not write this. I wrote this. The sterile glow of the monitor faded into a vivid memory. 15 years ago, the air conditioning in our tiny first apartment was broken. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I sat at a makeshift desk constructed from a hollow core door and 2 metal filing cabinets. I was 8 months pregnant with our first child. My ankles were swollen to the size of softballs, and my lower back radiated a dull, constant ache. David was asleep in the next room, snoring softly. I stayed awake, typing, until my fingers cramped and my vision blurred. I built the foundational architecture of that exact predictive algorithm to track erratic market fluctuations. I handed that code to David to help launch his fledgling consulting firm. He kissed my forehead and promised it was our shared future. Now he was passing my intellectual labor off as his sister's innate genius. The deception suddenly snapped a recent memory into sharp focus. 3 weeks ago, we hosted a catered dinner party for the executive team of Hathaway Innovations. Sarah sat directly across from me, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet. She loudly complained about the server load balancing protocols failing on the new Apex mainframes. She used the industry buzzwords with extreme confidence. I remembered tilting my head in genuine confusion. The architecture I designed did not use traditional server load balancing. It relied on a continuous feedback loop between independent processing nodes. I had gently corrected her terminology over the appetizer course. Sarah had flushed a deep crimson. She gripped her wine glass and snapped that I was just a housewife who needed to stick to pairing the correct wine with the fish course. She insulted my intelligence in front of 20 people to cover her own glaring ignorance. She had stolen my blueprint, but she did not even know how to read the legend. A cold, calculating calm washed over me. The financial starvation David inflicted on me earlier that morning was a crude, blunt weapon. He wanted to paralyze me with a lack of cash. This intellectual theft, however, was a fatal structural vulnerability in his empire. I reached into the bottom of my purse and pulled out a sleek silver thumb drive. It was a lingering habit from my early coding days to always carry encrypted digital storage. I plugged the drive into the back of his workstation. A subtle chime signaled the connection. I highlighted the entire Project Apex directory, every prospectus, every line of source code, every financial projection, and every marketing strategy. I dragged and dropped the entire folder into my hidden drive. A small progress bar appeared on the screen. I watched the green line fill, estimating 90 seconds until completion. I held my breath and listened for any creak in the floorboards upstairs. The house remained dead silent. But mere possession of the files was not true power. Legal ownership was true power. I opened a private browser tab and navigated to the Texas Secretary of State business portal. Using an anonymous prepaid debit card I had purchased months ago for household emergencies, I initiated the paperwork to register a new shell corporation. I typed the name Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC, into the registry. The website processed the nominal fee and generated a confirmation number. Once the corporate entity was legally secured, I accessed the Federal Copyright Registration Portal. I uploaded the original source code files. I timestamped them with my newly formed corporate entity listed as the sole creator and exclusive rights holder. The digital ink dried in the federal database. I now legally owned the DNA of David's future wealth. My work in the dark office was not finished. If David and Sarah were bold enough to steal my algorithms, they were likely hiding more lucrative secrets. I navigated away from the prospectus folder and opened his secure email client. The arrogance of his presumed victory meant he had left his two-factor authentication disabled for the evening. I clicked on the search bar and typed the keyword Apex. Hundreds of email threads populated the screen. I bypassed the internal marketing updates and focused on a series of messages from a prominent Silicon Valley venture capital firm. The sender was listed as a senior managing partner. I opened a PDF attachment titled Term Sheet Final. My eyes darted across the dense legal text. The numbers on the screen were staggering. David had secured a $50 million seed investment to launch the new Apex division. But ruthless venture capitalists do not hand out tens of millions of dollars based on a charismatic smile and a well-tailored suit. They demand rigid, impenetrable security. I scrolled rapidly to the collateral agreements section of the contract. There it was, laid out in stark, undeniable black and white. David had used the proprietary algorithms as the sole collateral for the high-interest loan. He formally guaranteed the investors that Hathaway Innovations held exclusive, undisputed ownership of the intellectual property. He signed a binding legal covenant swearing there were no competing claims to the code. I read the penalty clauses twice to ensure I understood the magnitude of his mistake. If the intellectual property ownership was ever challenged or invalidated, the massive loan would immediately enter default. The venture capital firm would trigger an acceleration clause. They would have the legal right to seize all of David's corporate assets. They would ruthlessly liquidate his entire existing company to recover their funds. David did not just steal my code to inflate his sister's fragile ego. He built a towering house of cards on a foundation he did not legally own. And I had just secretly purchased the land underneath him. I reached out and touched the cool plastic edge of the monitor. I held the pin to a corporate grenade. When I finally pulled it, David would not just lose his impending divorce. He would not just lose his business. He would face severe federal fraud charges for deliberately deceiving his primary investors. The file transfer completed with a soft ding. I safely ejected the thumb drive and slipped it back into the hidden pocket of my purse. I closed all the browser tabs and meticulously wiped the search history from the machine. I adjusted the leather chair so it sat at the exact angle I found it. I left the home office looking untouched. I stepped back into the dark hallway and pulled the heavy door shut. The latch clicked into place. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. David wanted to leave me destitute. He believed he held all the winning cards in a rigged game. He had no idea he was already playing a match he had irrevocably lost. The upcoming divorce mediation was no longer going to be a tearful negotiation for alimony. It was going to be a bloodless legal ambush. The glass walls of the downtown Austin high-rise offered a panoramic view of the Colorado River. The water glittered under the harsh midday sun. Inside the mediation room, the temperature was set to a freezing 68 degrees. The chill was intentional. It was a standard psychological tactic designed to make the opposing party uncomfortable and eager to leave. I sat on one side of a sprawling mahogany conference table. The leather chair felt stiff and unyielding beneath me. I wrapped my hands around a paper cup of stale coffee just to keep my fingers from trembling. Across the wide expanse of polished wood sat David. He looked immaculate in a tailored navy suit. His posture exuded a relaxed, unbothered confidence. He casually checked his phone, as if this divorce negotiation was merely a tedious administrative hurdle on his daily schedule. Beside him sat his lead counsel, Richard Thorne. Thorne was a man who charged $2,000 an hour to dismantle the lives of discarded spouses. He wore a patronizing smile that did not reach his cold, flat eyes. My own attorney, Marcus, sat next to me. He was a pragmatic and realistic man. We had spent the morning reviewing the preliminary dossier compiled by my forensic accountant. The shadow ledger confirmed my worst fears. David had been siphoning marital funds into the irrevocable trust for 36 months. The financial diversion was legally airtight. David had weaponized the Texas community property laws against me, using my own signature to seal the vault. Thorne slid a thin manila folder across the mahogany table. It stopped mere inches from my coffee cup. "Mr. Hathaway is prepared to be generous today," Thorne stated. His voice was smooth and practiced. "We want to expedite this process and spare everyone unnecessary emotional distress. The proposed settlement is straightforward." Marcus opened the folder. The silence in the room stretched thin and brittle. The only sound was the low mechanical hum of the building ventilation system. I watched a muscle feather in Marcus' jaw as he read down the single sheet of paper. He closed the folder and let out a heavy sigh. He turned to me, and the pity in his expression felt like a physical blow. "They are offering a transitional stipend," Marcus explained quietly. $5,000 a month for 12 months. You retain the leased vehicle you currently drive. Mr. Hathaway assumes the remaining lease payments. You relinquish all claims to the Lakeway estate, the retirement portfolios, and the corporate equity of Hathaway Innovations. In exchange, he will not pursue you for any shared household debt. I stared at the closed folder. A single year of rent and groceries. That was the grand total of my worth after 2 decades of marriage. It was a starvation diet disguised as a legal concession. It was a calculated insult intended to break my spirit. Grace Marcus whispered, leaning closer to me. "The trust is ironclad. We cannot pierce it in a state courtroom. If we reject this offer, we enter a protracted litigation phase. You do not have the liquid capital to fight a prolonged war. I strongly advise you to take the deal. We can try to negotiate an extra 6 months of support, but the core assets are shielded. A judge will not overturn that trust." The psychological pressure descended upon me like a suffocating weight. The walls of the glass room seemed to warp and press inward. A terrifying urge to fold washed over me. The conditioned dependency I had lived under for 20 years screamed at me to surrender. It would be so easy to pick up the black pen resting on the table and sign my name. It would guarantee my survival for another 12 months. The fear of stepping out into the world at 42 years old with a blank resume and zero capital paralyzed my throat. I pictured my grandmother emerald ring sitting in a pawn shop display case. I wondered if I would ever gather enough cash to buy it back. Thorne cleared his throat. "We require an answer today, Mrs. Hathaway. This offer expires at the close of business." Marcus asked Thorne for a brief private moment with his client. Thorne smirked and stood up. He walked out into the reception area to take a phone call. David, however, did not leave the room. He remained seated in his expensive leather chair. Once the heavy glass door clicked shut behind his lawyer, David leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the table and closed the physical distance between us. The charming facade he wore for the public melted away. "Take the deal, Gracie," he whispered. His tone dripped with a venomous, calculated cruelty. "You are broke. You have no leverage and no skills. Do not be stupid. You cannot bake your way out of poverty. Sign the paper before I rescind the offer and leave you sleeping in your car." My breath hitched. The cruelty of his words struck the deepest vulnerabilities in my chest. He was mocking the pathetic flower-covered housewife he thought he had defeated. He wanted me to grovel. He wanted to watch me break. I looked into the eyes of the man I used to love. I searched for any lingering trace of humanity or shared history. There was nothing left but raw, unchecked greed. Then my mind drifted to the hidden pocket inside my purse. I pictured the encrypted silver thumb drive resting safely against the fabric. I thought about the federal copyright registration, time-stamped and sealed under my shell corporation. I thought about the $50 million venture capital loan he secured using my stolen intellectual property. David believed the irrevocable trust was his impenetrable shield. He had no idea his entire corporate empire was built on top of a legal landmine that I now controlled. The suffocating panic vanished. The phantom weight of my pawned jewelry dissipated. A cold, sharp clarity aligned my spine. I did not need to beg for his scraps. I already owned the feast. I just needed to let him set the table. I picked up the black pen resting on the manila folder. David smiled. It was a victor smile, full of smug satisfaction. He leaned back in his chair, expecting my quiet surrender. I held the pen for a long, suspended second. Then I snapped it in half. The plastic casing cracked with a loud, sharp pop. Black ink splattered across the insulting settlement document. I pushed the ruined paper back across the table. "No," I said. My voice was calm and steady. David's smile vanished. His jaw tightened and a dark, furious color rushed into his cheeks. He glared at the broken pen and the ruined contract. He could not comprehend my refusal. In his mind, I was a helpless variable that he had already solved. Marcus blinked in shock. "Grace, are you certain? If we walk away from this table today, the legal fees will multiply exponentially." "I am certain, Marcus," I replied. I did not break eye contact with my husband. "I will not accept a single penny from this offer." David stood up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the polished concrete floor. He buttoned his suit jacket with sharp, jerky movements. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," David spat. He grabbed his briefcase. "You think you can play games with me? I built an empire while you picked out curtain fabrics. I will bury you so deep in legal debt, you will never recover." Thorne opened the glass door and stepped back into the room. He took one look at the ink-stained document and David's furious posture. The high-priced lawyer nodded slowly. He understood the negotiation had failed. "Very well," Thorne said. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a thick stack of formal legal filings. He tossed them onto the table in front of Marcus. "Consider this formal notice. We are initiating a hostile discovery process. We demand a full deposition under oath. We will subpoena every bank account, every communication, and every asset your client claims to possess. We will schedule the deposition for next Tuesday. Bring your checkbook, Mr. Sterling. My client is no longer feeling generous." David turned and walked out of the room without looking back. Thorne followed him, shutting the heavy glass door with a definitive thud. Marcus rubbed his temples and exhaled a long, shaky breath. He began gathering the hostile legal filings. He looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and deep pity. He believed I had just doomed myself out of stubborn pride. "Grace," Marcus said gently, "a formal deposition with Richard Thorne is a bloodbath. He will put you in a room with a court reporter and he will interrogate you until you break. They are going to use this to humiliate you on the public record." "Let them try," I answered softly. I gathered my purse and stood up from the stiff leather chair. The cold air in the room no longer bothered me. I felt an exhilarating rush of adrenaline flood my system. David wanted a formal deposition. He wanted to bring his high-priced lawyers and drag me into a recorded interrogation. He wanted an audience for my destruction. He had just handed me the exact stage I needed. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped into the blistering Texas heat. The blazing sun felt warm and comforting on my skin. The narrative was shifting. The audience could not see the trap yet, but the tripwire was set. David was arrogantly strutting toward his own execution, and he had printed the invitations himself. The impending deposition would not be my slaughter. It was going to be an explosive legal ambush. The law offices of Thorne & Associates occupied the entire penthouse floor of a glass tower in downtown Austin. The deposition room was a theater designed for intimidation. The walls were lined with dark walnut paneling, and the center of the space was dominated by a 20-foot granite conference table. A certified court reporter sat at the far end, with her fingers resting over her stenotype machine. David sat opposite me. He brought an audience. Patricia occupied a leather wingback chair in the corner, holding a designer handbag on her lap. She wore a look of serene anticipation. Sarah sat beside her brother. She was brought in under the pretext of being a character witness to testify about my lack of professional ambition. Sarah wore a sharp charcoal blazer and kept checking her phone, as if my destruction was merely delaying her busy schedule as a tech visionary. Richard Thorne adjusted his silk tie and began the interrogation. He spent the first hour walking David through the financial history of our marriage. David played his part to perfection. He spoke in a calm, measured tone. He crafted a narrative of a hard-working entrepreneur burdened by a financially illiterate spouse. "And during the last 15 years, Mr. Hathaway," Thorne asked, pacing slowly behind his client, "what were your wife's primary contributions to Hathaway Innovations?" David sighed. It was a theatrical display of weary patience. Grace managed the household. She arranged dinner parties. She baked. But in terms of corporate strategy or revenue generation, she had zero involvement. I built the empire. She simply enjoyed the proceeds. I sat perfectly still. My attorney, Marcus, sat beside me. He did not interrupt. He let David dig the hole deeper. Just 48 hours ago, Marcus had urged me to surrender. Then I showed him the encrypted thumb drive. I handed him the federal copyright registrations and the venture capital term sheets. The pragmatic, defeated lawyer transformed into a tactical predator. Today, Marcus exuded a quiet, lethal calm. David reached into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was heavy black resin, accented with rose gold. It was his signature weapon. He only carried it when he was finalizing multi-million-dollar acquisitions or securing binding board resolutions. He began spinning the pen between his fingers. The motion was a silent boast of his unassailable authority. "Let the record reflect," Thorne said, looking toward the court reporter, "that the defendant contributed no intellectual or financial capital to the business entity known as Hathaway Innovations. Furthermore, the new Apex project is the sole creation of Sarah Hathaway and funded by independent venture capital." Thorne returned to his seat and steepled his fingers. He looked at Marcus with a smug, patronizing smirk. "Your witness, Mr. Sterling, though I doubt there is much to cross-examine." Marcus opened his leather briefcase. He did not pull out the standard financial disclosures. He produced a single crisp manila folder and laid it flat on the granite table. "Mr. Hathaway," Marcus began. His voice lacked any hostility. It was smooth and conversational. "You stated under oath that your sister Sarah is the sole architect of the new Apex division. Is that correct?" David caught the pen in his palm and held it steady. "Yes, Sarah designed the predictive algorithm. She is the visionary behind the new expansion." Sarah sat up straighter in her chair. She smoothed the lapels of her charcoal blazer and offered a tight, self-satisfied smile. Marcus withdrew a stack of paper from the folder and slid it across the smooth granite surface. "I am entering Exhibit A into the record. This is a printed copy of the technical appendix from the Apex prospectus, specifically the source code defining the decentralized node processing system." Thorne frowned. He leaned forward and glanced at the pages. "I object to the relevance of this material. This is proprietary company data and has no bearing on a divorce settlement regarding an irrevocable trust." "It has direct bearing," Marcus countered smoothly. He slid a second document across the table. "I am entering Exhibit B. This is a certified federal copyright registration. It was filed and time-stamped under a corporate entity named Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC." David stared at the document. The confident mask began to slip, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What is Apex Horizon Holdings?" "It is a shell corporation, Mr. Hathaway," Marcus explained. He did not raise his voice. He delivered the facts with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "My client, Grace Hathaway, is the sole proprietor of that LLC. And as you can see on the federal registration, she is the exclusive legal owner of the source code you are using to launch your new division. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the rapid clicking of the court reporter typing every single word. Sarah stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. That is a lie. That is my project. She is just a housewife. She does not even know what a node processing system is. I finally looked directly at my sister-in-law. Line 42, Sarah. You declared a redundant floating point variable. It is an obscure syntactical quirk I developed 15 years ago, sitting in a sweltering apartment while I was 8 months pregnant. You stole my blueprint, but you forgot to scrub my fingerprints off the frame. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face as the reality of her own incompetence was exposed on the official legal record. David gripped his Mont Blanc pen so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. This is a desperate bluff. A copyright registration takes months to litigate. The estate trust still protects my liquid capital. You get nothing today, Grace. Marcus shook his head. He pulled the final document from his folder. It was the venture capital term sheet. We do not need to litigate the trust, Mr. Hathaway, Marcus stated. He tapped his index finger against the bold penalty clauses highlighted in yellow. You secured a $50 million seed investment using the Apex intellectual property as your sole collateral. You signed a binding legal covenant swearing you held undisputed ownership of that code. David read the highlighted text. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. If you do not agree to our revised settlement terms right this second, Marcus continued, his voice turned hard and unrelenting, I will file a federal injunction before the courthouse closes today. I will freeze the use of the Apex code. That injunction will trigger an immediate default on your venture capital loan. The investors will execute their acceleration clause. They will liquidate your entire company to recover their funds. And when they discover you knowingly pledged collateral you did not own, they will refer you to the federal prosecutor for wire fraud. The threat hung in the freezing air. It was an ironclad checkmate. David was no longer fighting a divorce proceeding. He was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment and total financial ruin. The vintage Mont Blanc pen slipped from David's trembling fingers. It hit the granite table with a sharp, distinct clatter. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The illusion of his power shattered. The man who had arrogantly told me I would never survive without him was now suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. Patricia jumped to her feet. The polished, serene matriarch vanished. In her place stood a terrified opportunist, scrambling for self-preservation. She pointed a shaking finger at her son. "David, what did you do?" Patricia shrieked. Her voice echoed off the walnut paneling. "You told us this was handled. If the venture firm liquidates the company, they will seize the family estate. They will take my house." Sarah backed away from the table. She looked at her brother as if he were carrying a contagious disease. "I had nothing to do with the funding. You told me the code was clean, David. You put my name on a stolen project. I am not going to prison for you." The loyalty David believed he commanded from his family evaporated the instant his money was threatened. They turned on him with the vicious speed of starving animals. They did not care about his well-being. They only cared about shielding themselves from the incoming blast radius. Thorne scrambled to salvage the situation. The high-priced lawyer dropped his patronizing smirk and looked at Marcus with wide, desperate eyes. "What are your demands, Mr. Sterling?" "Everything," Marcus replied calmly. The terms were dictated with brutal efficiency. David would immediately dissolve the irrevocable trust. He would transfer the deed to the Lakeway estate solely into my name. I would retain all liquid capital in our joint accounts and take a 50% equity stake in the remaining clean assets of Hathaway Innovations. He would assume all outstanding household debt. In exchange, I would grant his company a restricted, non-exclusive license to use the Apex code, allowing him to barely keep his venture capital investors at bay. David sat frozen. His eyes were hollow and vacant. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the cheap plastic ballpoint pen Thorne offered him. He signed the dissolution documents and the asset transfer agreements. He signed away his fortune, his leverage, and his pride. I stood up from the granite table and smoothed the front of my dress. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not offer a single word of parting wisdom. I walked out of the glass deposition room, leaving the man who tried to starve me sitting in the ruins of his own shattered empire. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The heavy steel doors closed, sealing my victory. I was no longer a discarded dependent. I was the architect of my own survival. But the ultimate payoff was still 6 months away. The autumn sun dipped below the Texas hill country, casting a deep amber glow across my corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the Austin skyline. 6 months had passed since I walked out of that freezing deposition room. The air in my new sanctuary smelled of fresh espresso and expensive leather. I stood by the glass holding a crystal goblet of Pinot Noir. I watched the city lights flicker to life. My boutique strategic consultancy was thriving. I built Apex Horizon Holdings from a shell corporation into a premier advisory firm. I did not rely on David or his network. I utilized the sharp analytical mind I had buried for 2 decades. The transition was arduous. There were late nights spent reviewing dense corporate portfolios and early mornings negotiating with ruthless executives. But every ounce of fatigue was fueled by the undeniable thrill of genuine autonomy. I was no longer a shadow. I was the architect of my own empire. A sleek tablet rested on my tempered glass desk. It displayed the finalized contracts for a corporate acquisition I had spent the last 3 months orchestrating. The ink was dry, the wire transfers were confirmed, the victory was secured. My personal cell phone vibrated against the polished glass. The sudden rhythmic hum broke the quiet tranquility of the evening. I picked up the device and looked at the caller identification. The screen displayed a name I had not spoken aloud in half a year. David Hathaway. A faint smile touched the corners of my mouth. I swiped the screen to accept the call and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I simply listened to the ragged, uneven breathing on the other end of the line. "Grace," David said. His voice sounded thin and hollow. It lacked the smooth, practiced resonance he used to captivate boardrooms. "Please do not hang up. I know I have no right to call you, but I have nowhere else to turn." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The vintage was complex and rich. "Speak, David. My time is incredibly expensive these days." I heard him swallow hard. The background noise on his end suggested he was sitting in his car. Traffic rushed past his windows. "The Apex division is failing," he confessed. The admission tumbled out of him in a rushed, desperate breath. Sarah could not maintain the predictive algorithm. The localized nodes require continuous manual tuning to adapt to live market fluctuations. She did not understand the underlying architecture. She applied a universal patch to the system, and it corrupted the entire feedback loop. The software is outputting garbage data. I walked back to my desk and traced my finger along the edge of the tablet. I already knew every detail of his operational collapse. I had been watching it happen in real time from my high-rise vantage point. "And your venture capital investors?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "How did they react to the corrupted data?" "They are pulling their funding," David choked out. The panic in his chest was audible. "They conducted an emergency audit yesterday. When they realized the system was broken, they triggered the default clauses on the seed loan. They are demanding immediate repayment of the remaining $30 million. If I do not secure a bridge loan by Monday morning, they will seize Hathaway Innovations. They will liquidate everything I have spent my entire life building." He paused, hoping for a sympathetic response. He was waiting for the soft, accommodating housewife to emerge from the silence and soothe his anxieties. He was banking on the ghost of a woman he had discarded. "That sounds like a catastrophic structural failure," I replied. "It is unfortunate you entrusted a complex machine to an operator who could not read the manual, but I fail to see how this involves me." "I need your help, Gracie," he pleaded. The old nickname slipped from his tongue in a calculated attempt to invoke a shared history. I know your consultancy is highly profitable. I heard about the contracts you secured with the defense sector. I need a $5 million bridge loan to cover the immediate margin call, just enough to keep the investors at bay while I hire a crisis engineering team to fix the code. I will give you a 20% equity stake in the parent company. I will pay you double the standard interest rate. I am begging you. The silence stretched across the digital connection. I savored the bitter irony of the moment. 6 months ago, he stood in the foyer of my home and confidently declared I would never survive without his salary. He told me to walk out the door with nothing. Now he was reduced to begging for his corporate survival from the very woman he tried to starve. You do not need a crisis engineering team, David, I said smoothly. The code is not broken. It functioned exactly as it was designed to function when starved of proper intellectual maintenance. And you do not need $5 million, because you are not going to salvage Hathaway Innovations. Grace, please, his voice cracked. Do not do this out of spite. I was arrogant. I was cruel. I admit it. But if the company goes under, hundreds of people lose their jobs. My mother loses her retirement dividends. Do not let your anger destroy everything. I set my wine glass down on the desk. The crystal made a soft, definitive clink against the glass surface. I am not angry, David, I stated. The icy calm in my voice caused him to stop breathing. Anger is an erratic emotion. It clouds judgment. What I am is a highly effective corporate strategist. I did not just rebuild my wealth over the last 6 months. I monitored your impending collapse, and I recognized a lucrative opportunity when I saw one. What are you talking about? He whispered. 2 months ago, I signed an exclusive advisory contract with Vanguard Zenith, I explained. I named the billion-dollar apex competitor that David had spent his entire career trying to defeat. They were very interested in acquiring the remnants of your decentralized node processing system, but they did not want to pay a premium to purchase a healthy company. So we waited. We let Sarah run your division into the ground. We let your venture capitalists panic. I tapped the screen of my tablet, waking the display to show the finalized acquisition contracts. This morning, Vanguard Zenith quietly purchased your distressed debt from the venture capital firm, I continued. I articulated each word with lethal precision. They bought your $30 million default obligation at a steep discount. They are now the primary secured creditors of Hathaway Innovations. And they appointed my firm, Apex Horizon Holdings, to act as the sole managing proxy for the debt collection. A low, guttural sound escaped David's throat. It was the sound of a man realizing the floor beneath him had just vanished. You did not call the venture capital firm tonight, David, I said. You called the executioner. I own your debt. I own your collateral. I own the future of your company. You orchestrated a hostile takeover, he breathed. The horror in his voice was absolute. You partnered with my biggest rival to destroy me. I partnered with a firm that recognized the true value of my intellect. I corrected him. You stole my blueprint and built a house of cards. I simply bought the wind that blew it down. Grace, you cannot do this. He scrambled his words, tripping over each other. We were married for 20 years. You cannot take my legacy. Your legacy was built on my silent labor, I reminded him. You forfeit any claim to mercy the morning you canceled my debit card and told me I was worthless. The deadline for your bridge loan is irrelevant. As the proxy for your secured creditor, I am officially calling the debt. You are in default as of this exact moment. Vanguard Zenith will begin asset seizure on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I will fight this, he yelled. The desperation turned into frantic, useless rage. I will hire Thorne. I will tie this up in litigation for years. You cannot afford Richard Thorne anymore, I noted coldly. Your liquid assets are frozen. Your corporate accounts belong to the creditors. But I want to assure you the company will be in excellent hands. I have already drafted my first executive order as the new shadow director. David went silent. He was trapped in the agonizing reality of his defeat. Do you remember Elena and Rachel, I asked? the 2 senior software developers you fired last year because they were, quote, too opinionated and difficult to manage, unquote? He did not answer. He only offered a ragged, defeated breath. I am rehiring them, I told him. I am placing them at the head of the Apex division. They will be receiving executive salaries and comprehensive equity packages. They are going to repair the damage your sister caused. They are going to run the department you could not sustain. Hathaway Innovations is going to thrive, David. It just will not belong to you. Grace, he sobbed. The mighty visionary was finally broken, crying, alone in the dark interior of his car. Please, I have nothing left. Then you finally know exactly how it feels, I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not wait for his next apology. I did not care to hear his final, desperate plea. I pressed the red button on the screen. The call disconnected with a sharp, satisfying click. I stood in the quiet luxury of my high-rise office. The Texas sky outside my window had turned a deep, endless black, scattered with the bright, resilient lights of the city. I picked up my wine glass and took a final, victorious sip. The wine tasted like freedom. I was no longer a discarded dependent hiding behind a flower-covered kitchen counter. I was an unassailable corporate architect, and my foundation was carved from solid stone. If you have ever been told you were incapable of surviving on your own, only to build an empire out of the very stones they threw at you, I hope this story reminded you of your inherent power. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not a loud argument, but a quiet, flawless execution. I would love to know where this story found you today. Drop a comment below and let me know what city you are watching from. I read every single one. We have new stories of resilience and retribution waiting for you every day on Salt Vengeance. Subscribe now so you never miss a moment of reclaiming your life. Keep walking this road with us. The Foundation of Truth. Lessons from the Ashes of an Empire. We often look at the sudden collapse of a dynasty and wonder where the structural failure began. When a corporate titan falls from grace, society tends to look for the immediate catalyst: a bad investment, a ruthless competitor, a sudden shift in the market. But in the case of David Hathaway and the shattered remnants of his tech empire, the fault line did not originate in a sterile boardroom or within a corrupted line of computer code. The true fracture began decades earlier, in the quiet, formative moments of childhood. When we strip away the high-interest venture capital loans, the glass-walled offices, and the bitter divorce depositions, the story of Grace and David reveals itself as a profound, cautionary tale. It is fundamentally a story about parenting values, family responsibility, and the perilous consequences of raising children without a steadfast moral compass. It forces us to examine the invisible inheritance we pass down to the next generation, long before money ever changes hands. The architecture of entitlement. Consider the matriarch Patricia. She raised David and Sarah in a world wrapped in the comforts of old money and deep-seated privilege. From the outside, she appeared to be the bedrock of a traditional, successful American family. Yet her parenting lacked the most crucial ingredients of long-term guidance: honesty and fairness. Instead of teaching her children the value of hard work, accountability, and the inherent worth of other human beings, she taught them entitlement. Patricia taught her son that success was a birthright, and that the people around him, even his own wife, were merely resources to be managed, audited, and discarded when they were no longer convenient. She raised a daughter who believed she could wear the title of a visionary without ever putting in the grueling, silent labor required to earn it. By shielding her children from the natural consequences of their own shortcomings, Patricia built a family culture devoid of emotional awareness. David and Sarah learned to navigate the world with a chilling detachment, unable to recognize the quiet sacrifices of those who supported them. They were taught to measure a person's value by their utility, a tragic flaw that ultimately orchestrated their own ruin. The provider myth and family responsibility. In American culture, the traditional family structure often places a heavy emphasis on the role of the provider. David wore this title like a crown. He stood on stages and accepted the applause, genuinely believing that his paycheck absolved him of any deeper emotional or moral responsibilities to his partner. He weaponized his financial success, using it as a tool for control rather than a foundation for shared security. True family responsibility requires far more than merely paying the mortgage or funding an estate trust. It requires a profound, unwavering partnership. It demands the humility to acknowledge that no empire is built in a vacuum. David's failure was not just a failure of business ethics, it was a fundamental failure of love. By secretly funneling marital assets into an irrevocable trust and stealing his wife's intellectual property, he abandoned the sacred duty of a spouse. He violated the unspoken covenant of marriage, which relies on mutual trust and transparent honesty. When a parent models this kind of deceit, the rot spreads through the entire family tree. Children absorb the unspoken rules of their environment. Had David and Grace shared children, those children would have learned that betrayal is an acceptable strategy for wealth preservation, and that vulnerability is a weakness to be exploited. Grace's eventual retaliation was not merely an act of vengeance. It was an act of necessary correction. She leveled the playing field, forcing her husband to finally face the reality of his own hollow character. The weight of emotional awareness. Raising children within a traditional family structure requires a hyper-vigilant dedication to emotional awareness. It is the ability to look at the people in your home and see them as independent souls with their own dreams, fears, and breaking points. David lacked this vision entirely. He looked at Grace and saw only a quiet housewife, a woman he assumed would simply fold under the pressure of poverty. He failed to see the brilliant, resilient architect who had coded his future at 3 a.m. This blind spot is a dangerous trap in modern parenting. When we fail to instill empathy in our children, we send them out into the world unarmed against their own hubris. David's arrogance blinded him to the trap he was walking into. If Patricia had raised a son who possessed even a fraction of emotional intelligence, David might have recognized the silent, tactical shift in his wife's demeanor. He might have understood that a woman backed into a corner, stripped of her safety net, becomes the most dangerous opponent in the room. Instead, his lack of emotional awareness led him straight to the deposition table, where his arrogance was dismantled piece by piece. Honesty, fairness, and the American legacy. Ultimately, the legacy we leave our children is not defined by the size of the estate trusts we build or the corporate titles we secure. Our true legacy is carved from the values we practice when no one is watching. Honesty and fairness are not just pleasant ideals to be stitched onto decorative pillows. They are the structural steel required to hold a life together. Grace survived because she knew the truth of her own worth. She did not need to scream or negotiate for her dignity. She quietly gathered her evidence, secured her intellectual property, and waited for the house of cards to collapse under its own weight. She embodied the harsh, unyielding truth of fairness. You cannot build a lasting empire on stolen ground. When the venture capitalists came to collect, they were not just seizing corporate assets. They were foreclosing on a lifetime of deceit. As we navigate the complexities of raising families, guiding our children, and building our own lives, we must ask ourselves what kind of foundation we are pouring. Are we teaching our children to rely on smoke and mirrors, or are we giving them the tools to build something real? Are we modeling partnerships based on control, or relationships anchored in mutual respect? If you find yourself reflecting on the foundations of your own life, or if you have ever had to rebuild your world after someone you trusted tried to tear it down, you are not alone. There is a quiet strength in starting over, and an undeniable power in recognizing your own worth. We explore these deep, resonant journeys every single day, uncovering the stories of those who turned betrayal into a blueprint for survival. Join our community and subscribe to Salt Vengeance today so you never miss a moment of resilience, truth, and the ultimate reclamation of self. As the screen fades and the noise of the day settles, take a look around the rooms of your own home. Listen to the quiet hum of the life you have constructed. We all believe we know the people sleeping down the hall, and we all assume the ground beneath our feet is solid. But one has to wonder, if the lights suddenly went out and the accounts ran dry, what kind of foundation would you actually be standing on?